You have 30 days before I bring this to every investor who still trusts your name.
You have no right to be in my office.
You have 30 days, Hana said, sliding the folder across the table, before I bring this to every investor who still trusts your name. Ada stared at her, the papers between them, the quiet click of a door Hana had locked behind her before either of them realized it. You have no right to be in my office, Ada said. I have every right. Hana's voice was calm, almost pleasant, the same calm she'd used the night she'd threatened Ada's life in an empty office months ago. 11% of the Western Ports shares, still mine, still legally tied to a company you now help run. Jae-min ended that agreement with the divorce. He ended the marriage, Hana corrected. My father was far too careful to let the shares end with it. Ada's hands stayed still on the desk, though her pulse hadn't. Why are you doing this now? You lost, Hana. You lost the marriage, the company's trust, your father's approval. What's left to take? Hana leaned forward, and for the first time there was no anger in her expression at all, only something colder, more patient. You, she said simply. I told you once that what I'd already done was restraint. This is what happens when I stop restraining myself. 30 days, Ada. Convince him to walk away from you, or watch me tear apart everything he's built to prove exactly how expensive loving you really is. She rose, smoothing her coat, and paused at the door. Tell him I said hello. The lock clicked open. Hana was gone before Ada could find the words to respond, before she could even decide who to call first. Do you think Ada tells Jae-min immediately, or tries to handle Hana alone again? And what do you think Hana is really after? Let me know your theory, and stay close, because this one gets more dangerous fast. Subscribe so you don't miss where it goes. 6 months had passed since the divorce was finalized. 6 months of quiet mornings and stabilized boardrooms, of Jae-min and Ada learning what it meant to build something without a war raging around them. They had both believed the war was over. Hana's 11% stake in the Western Ports Agreement changed that in the span of a single locked-door conversation, a legal thread neither of them had thought to examine closely enough, buried in language written by a father who never did anything without a contingency. But the shares were only the beginning. What neither Ada nor Jae-min yet understood was that Hana wasn't only fighting a business war this time. She had spent 6 months quietly rebuilding a different kind of access. Dinners with Jae-min disguised as business updates, conversations that left small invisible marks neither of them noticed forming. What did Hana actually want? The company, or something far more personal? Would Ada make the same mistake twice, carrying a threat alone, instead of trusting the man who'd already proven he'd choose her? And what happens when doubt is planted so carefully that the person carrying it doesn't even realize it isn't his own? The countdown had already begun. Neither of them knew yet that the real danger wasn't the 30 days. It was everything Hana had already done in the 6 months before them. The months following the divorce had been kinder to Jae-min and Ada than either expected. The scandal that once threatened to collapse the Western Ports contract had settled into old news, replaced by newer gossip, newer deals, newer distractions for a city that never stayed fixed on one story for long. The board, initially nervous, had come to respect Ada's presence in meetings, her instincts sharp, her judgment careful, her ability to read a room, still the same skill that had once made Jae-min trust her over his own advisors. They moved in together 3 months after the divorce, into an apartment neither of them associated with the house that never felt like home. It was smaller, quieter, filled with the kind of ordinary domestic details neither of them had experienced in years. Mismatched mugs, a shared grocery list stuck to the refrigerator, mornings that started with coffee instead of calculated silence. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Ada admitted one evening, curled against him on the couch, months into their new life together. "Nothing's going wrong," Jae-min said. "I know, that's what worries me." He'd laughed then, pulling her closer, promising her that peace didn't mean disaster was coming. He believed it when he said it.
Neither of them knew that peace, for people like them, was rarely more than a pause. Hana's exile from her own family's inner circle had been swift and quiet, the kind of consequence wealthy families preferred to handle behind closed doors rather than in headlines. Her father, humiliated by the exposure of the old debt, the same debt that had once purchased her daughter's marriage, blamed her for the scandal rather than himself, unwilling to accept that his own choices had built the foundation Hana's cruelty grew from. "You embarrassed this family," he told her, the first and only time they discussed it directly, "not because you divorced him, but because you let the reason become public. A smart woman handles her humiliation quietly." Hana had absorbed the lecture the way she'd absorbed every lesson her father ever taught her, with careful, controlled silence, filing it away as fuel rather than correction. She still held her shares. She still held the 11% no one thought to strip from her during the divorce negotiations, buried in a clause about the ports agreement that predated the marriage itself. And she still held, more dangerously, 5 years of intimate knowledge about the man she'd once been married to, his insecurities, his fears, the particular quiet way doubt crept into him when he believed he wasn't being watched. She began cultivating access slowly, careful never to move too fast. A message about a shareholder update, professional and brief. A request for a coffee meeting to discuss the transition of remaining assets, reasonable enough that Jae-min saw no harm in agreeing, believing the divorce had left them capable of civility, if nothing else. Their first meeting was exactly as businesslike as she intended it to appear. "I'm not here to relitigate anything," Hana said, sliding a folder of legitimate shareholder documents across the table. "I still hold a stake in this company. I'd rather manage that stake with some cooperation than force everyone into more legal battles than necessary." "That's reasonable," Jae-min said, cautious but willing. "I've grown a great deal since the divorce," Hana continued, her tone measured, believable. "I'd like to think we can both be adults about the parts of our lives that still overlap." It was reasonable. It was calm. It gave Jae-min no reason for alarm, no reason to mention the meeting to Ada beyond a passing comment about sorting out some lingering shareholder details with Hana, delivered so casually that Ada thought nothing of it either. That was precisely the opening Hana needed. Their second meeting, weeks later, drifted from business into something quieter, more personal, disguised as simple conversation between two people who'd once shared a life. "Can I ask you something?" Hana said, stirring her coffee slowly. "Does she ever make you feel like yourself, or does she make you feel like the version of yourself that's useful to her?" "That's not a fair question," Jae-min said, though something in his chest tightened slightly at the words. "I'm not trying to be unfair. I watched you for 5 years, Jae-min. I know the difference between the man you actually are and the man you become when someone needs something from you." She shrugged lightly, as though the observation cost her nothing. I'm not saying she's using you. I'm saying I hope you've actually asked yourself the question, instead of assuming the answer, because the alternative is too uncomfortable to consider. He hadn't asked himself the question. Not directly, not until she planted it, small and precise, exactly where doubt liked to live. He told himself it meant nothing. He didn't mention the conversation to Ada that night, or the next, telling himself there was nothing worth repeating in an observation that clearly came from a bitter woman trying to unsettle him. But the question stayed. It stayed through the following week, through a small disagreement with Ada over something inconsequential that shouldn't have mattered, through a quiet moment where he watched her negotiate a deal with practiced confidence and found himself, for one unwelcome second, wondering whether that same confidence had once been aimed at him with intention rather than genuine feeling. He hated the thought the moment it formed. He didn't understand yet that hating a thought doesn't stop it from taking root. Meanwhile, Ada carried her own quiet weight. Hana's locked-door ultimatum sat heavy in her mind for 3 days before she made a decision that differed from the mistake she'd made the first time. She would not carry this alone, not again, not when carrying this alone the first time had nearly cost her everything.
But when she finally sat Jae-min down to tell him, something in his response felt different than she expected. Not disbelief, not dismissal, something quieter, more hesitant, a half-second delay before he reached for her hand that hadn't existed in any of their conversations before. "We'll handle it," he said, "together." The words were right, the timing wasn't. Ada noticed. She always noticed the things people tried hardest to hide. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Jae-min said, too quickly. "I'm just thinking about how to handle the shares, that's all." It wasn't all, though neither of them said so out loud. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment far smaller than the mansion she'd once occupied, Hana allowed herself, for the first time in months, something that almost resembled satisfaction. The shares were real, the threat was real, but the war she actually intended to win wasn't being fought in a boardroom at all. It was being fought in the half-second pause before a man reassured the woman he loved, a pause that hadn't existed a month ago and that Hana had spent 6 careful weeks teaching him to make. The disagreement that finally cracked the surface between them happened on an ordinary Tuesday over something so small neither of them could explain afterward how it had escalated so quickly. Ada had rescheduled a dinner with an important client without consulting Jae-min first, a decision well within her authority, one she'd made a dozen times before without incident. This time, his reaction was sharper than the situation warranted. "You should have checked with me before moving it," he said, an edge in his voice that startled them both. "I've rescheduled meetings before, Jae-min. This is my job." "I know your job," he said, then stopped himself, visibly hearing how the words sounded once they'd already left him. Ada studied him carefully, the way she used to study rooms full of dangerous men, reading the shift in him before he fully understood it himself. "This isn't about the dinner. It's not about anything. I had a long day." "Don't do that," she said quietly. "Don't shrink whatever this actually is into something small enough to dismiss. You've been different for weeks, distant in a way I can't name. If something's wrong, I need you to tell me instead of making me guess." He hesitated, that same half-second pause Hana had spent weeks cultivating, the pause that had nothing to do with doubting Ada and everything to do with a question he'd never fully voiced even to himself. "I don't know how to explain it," he admitted finally. "It's not about you doing anything wrong. It's—" He stopped, frustrated with his own inability to name it. "It's a feeling I can't shake, and I don't know where it came from." "What feeling?" He didn't answer.
He didn't have the words yet, only the residue of a question Hana had planted so carefully he'd mistaken it for his own doubt instead of recognizing it as someone else's design. Ada watched him carry that silence to bed that night, watched him wake distracted the next morning, and made a decision of her own, quiet, careful, the kind of decision she'd learned to make from years of surviving rooms full of people who underestimated her. She would find out exactly what Hana had been saying to him. It didn't take long. A conversation with his assistant, offered casually over coffee, confirmed what Ada had already begun to suspect. Jae-min had met with Hana twice in the past 6 weeks, both meetings undisclosed, both longer than the brief shareholder updates he'd mentioned in passing. He didn't say much about them, the assistant admitted, clearly uncomfortable being asked, just that they were about the transition of the remaining shares. He seemed distracted after the second one. I assumed it was just old memories. Divorces are messy, even amicable ones. Ada thanked her and said nothing else, though the word distracted stayed with her long after the conversation ended. She didn't confront Jae-min immediately. She sat with the information for a full day, turning it over, trying to separate her old fear, the fear of history repeating, of being the woman left behind for the wife who'd always been there first, from the actual knowledge she had of the man she loved. She thought of Atlanta, of the business partner who'd once smiled at her for 2 years before quietly rerouting client contracts to himself, leaving her to discover the betrayal only after it was too late to salvage what she'd built.
She'd trusted her instincts then, too, right up until the moment they'd failed her completely. It had taken her years to trust her own judgment again, and even longer to let herself believe Jae-min was different from every version of betrayal she'd survived before him. She knew Jae-min. She trusted the 5 years of watching him choose honesty over convenience, even when honesty cost him everything. But she also knew Hana, knew the particular surgical patience of a woman who didn't need to win a war outright when she could simply make her opponent doubt whether the war was worth fighting. When she finally raised it with him, she chose her words with the same care she'd used the night she first told him about Hana's threats months before their divorce. "You've been meeting with her," Ada said, finding him in the kitchen of their apartment, the ordinary domesticity of the moment making the conversation feel stranger somehow. "More than once, longer than a shareholder update should take." Jae-min's expression shifted. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. The recognition of a man realizing how something reasonable in the moment looked entirely different once spoken aloud. "They were business meetings, Ada." "Were they?" "Yes." He paused, setting down the mug in his hand. "Mostly." "Mostly," Ada repeated quietly. "What does mostly mean?" Jae-min ran a hand through his hair, the closest he came to visible frustration with himself. "She asked me a question a few weeks ago, about us, about whether I actually know you or just believe what I want to believe about you. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I wasn't going to let her get into my head. But she did." "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it, the raw uncertainty in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd simply lied. "I don't think I doubt you, Ada, but I can't explain why something's felt different since that conversation, and I hate that I can't explain it, because it makes me feel like I'm betraying you just by not having an answer." Ada absorbed this in silence. Old fears rising alongside new ones, the fear of history repeating, layered now with something more painful, the fear that even a man who loved her honestly could still be quietly reshaped by someone who understood exactly which insecurities to press. "She's been planning this," Ada said slowly, the pieces settling into place.
Not the shares, or not only the shares. This, making you doubt me without ever having to prove anything false, because doubt doesn't need proof to do damage. I should have told you about the meetings. Yes, Ada said, you should have. After everything we survived to get here, Jae-min, I thought we agreed silence wasn't something we did to each other anymore. I know. I'm sorry. I'm not looking for an apology right now, Ada said, quieter now, the anger giving way to something more tired. I'm looking for a reason to believe this won't keep happening every time she decides to reach for you again. The mini cliffhanger of the moment wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no slammed doors. It was quieter than that, and somehow more dangerous. Two people who trusted each other completely, standing in the same room, both aware that a third person's manipulation had found the exact seam between them that neither had known to protect. I need some time, Ada said finally. Not away from you, just time to figure out how much of what I'm feeling right now is about you, and how much of it is about every version of this story I've survived before you. Jae-min didn't argue. He understood, better than most, the particular exhaustion of fighting a war you didn't start and couldn't fully see. She slept in the guest room that night, the first time since they'd moved in together, and lay awake listening to the unfamiliar silence of a wall between them instead of the warmth of his shoulder. The following days passed with a careful, deliberate distance between them. Not a breakup, not quite a fight, but the kind of quiet recalibration two people undertake when they realized an outside force had gotten further inside their relationship than either wanted to admit. Ada threw herself into countering the share threat directly, meeting with the company's legal team to examine the original agreement Hana's father had drafted years before the marriage.
The language was precise, carefully worded to survive exactly the kind of divorce that had ended the marriage without ending Hana's claim. It's airtight, the lead attorney admitted during one meeting, sliding the document across the table. Unless we can prove the shares were part of the marital agreement rather than separate from it, she retains full voting rights. Can we prove that? Ada asked. Possibly. It'll take time we may not have before her 30-day deadline. Then we make time, Ada said, and spent the following 2 days buried in old contracts, cross-referencing dates, searching for the thread that would unravel Hana's claim the way the old debt had unraveled her marriage. Jae-min, meanwhile, wrestled with a version of himself he didn't recognize, a man who'd spent 5 years learning to distrust anything that felt too easy, now uncertain whether that instinct was protecting him or poisoning the one relationship in his life that had never once felt like a transaction. He found himself replaying old moments with Ada, searching them for evidence of the doubt Hana had planted, and hating himself every time he caught his own mind doing exactly what she'd designed it to do. He remembered the night she'd stood her ground against him in his office, remembered the exhaustion in her voice the night she'd finally told him about Hana's first threats, remembered every unguarded moment of the past year that had never once felt calculated. None of it supported the doubt, and yet the doubt persisted anyway, stubborn and formless, precisely because it had never been built on evidence in the first place, only on a question asked by someone who understood exactly which wound in him had never fully healed. That evening he found Ada in his office long after most of the building had emptied, staring at a spreadsheet he clearly wasn't actually reading either, having wandered there out of habit rather than purpose. "I've been thinking," she said, closing the door behind her, "about what you said, about not knowing why something felt different." He looked up, cautious, unsure which version of this conversation he was about to have. "I don't think you doubted me," Ada continued. "I think you doubted yourself, whether you actually know how to trust something good after years of being taught that everything in your life is a transaction.
Hana didn't create that fear in you, Jamin. She just knew exactly where to find it. That doesn't make it hurt less, he admitted. No, Ada agreed, but it means the fear isn't about me, and it means fixing it isn't about proving something to her. It's about you deciding, for yourself, whether you're going to keep letting a 5-year-old marriage define what you believe you deserve. Jamin studied her for a long moment, something in his shoulders loosening slightly. I chose you, he said quietly, not because I had to, because for the first time in my life, choosing something didn't feel like a transaction. I don't want to lose that because I let her convince me it was too good to be real. Then don't, Ada said, but you have to be honest with me next time, not because you owe me perfection, because we already survived one version of this story where silence almost cost us everything. I know. Say it then, whatever you're actually afraid of, out loud, to me, not to her. Jamin exhaled slowly, the walls he'd spent a lifetime building cracking just enough to let something honest through. I'm afraid that no matter how much I choose you, some part of me will always wonder if I'm capable of being loved without it being tied to what I can offer someone. Hana asked if you make me feel like myself or like the version of myself that's useful to you. I hate that the question worked on me. I hate that some part of me has been afraid of the answer since the day my father told me who I'd marry. Ada crossed the room and took his hand, something steadying passing between them in the quiet office. I love you for what you can offer me, she said. I loved you the night you stood your ground in an empty office more than I've loved almost anything in my life, not because of the empire, because of the man underneath it who chose to treat me like I wasn't one either. Something in his expression finally broke open, the doubt Hana had spent 6 weeks carefully cultivating, losing its grip in the face of the one thing it couldn't survive. Honesty, spoken plainly, without armor, between two people finally choosing to fight for each other instead of letting silence do Hana's work for her. I'm sorry, Jamin said, for not telling you sooner, for letting her get far enough in to make you doubt anything. We're not doing that again, Ada said. Either of us. Whatever she throws next, we face it together, or we don't survive it at all.
He reached for her then, slow and certain, and when he kissed her, it carried none of the hesitation that had lived between them for the past several days, only the relief of two people choosing, deliberately, to close a distance someone else had tried to build. I meant what I said, he murmured against her. Choosing you has never once felt like a transaction. I let fear tell me otherwise for a few weeks. I won't let it again. Good, Ada said, because I plan on making sure Hana regrets underestimating exactly how hard we're willing to fight for this. The following morning, they presented a united front to the legal team, working through the night to build the strongest possible argument against the validity of Hana's remaining shares. The attorney's initial pessimism gave way to cautious optimism as Ada uncovered a clause buried deep in the original agreement, language suggesting the shares had, in fact, been intended as part of the broader marital contract, despite Hana's father's efforts to separate them on paper. It's not conclusive, the attorney warned, but it's enough to force a review, enough to buy time at minimum. Then let's use it, Jamin said. Outside the office window, Seoul's skyline stretched on, indifferent to the quiet turning point that had occurred within one small room days earlier. A turning point Hana would not learn about for several more days, by which time her carefully planted doubt would have already lost the war she'd spent 6 weeks trying to win. But the battle over the shares remained unresolved, the 30-day deadline drawing closer with each passing day, and somewhere across the city,
Hana was only just beginning to realize her quieter strategy had failed to account for the one thing she'd never fully understood about the relationship she was trying to unravel. That Ada and Jae-min's bond wasn't built on the absence of doubt. It was built on the choice, made again and again, to fight through it together. Hana learned of the legal challenge to her shares on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by her own attorney in a tone that made it clear he considered the case increasingly difficult to win. "They've found language suggesting the shares were part of the marital contract," he said, sliding the filing across her desk. "If the court agrees, you lose your claim entirely, not reduced, entirely." Hana read through the filing in silence, her composure intact, even as the ground shifted beneath a plan she'd spent months constructing. "There has to be a way to strengthen our position," she said. "There might be," the attorney admitted carefully, "but it would require you to testify to the original intent of the agreement, meaning your father's role in negotiating the debt, publicly, under oath. Given the scandal that already came out during the divorce, I'd advise against it. It would confirm everything already suspected and give the board grounds to remove you from consideration entirely, regardless of the shares." Hana sat with that for a long moment, understanding settling over her with a clarity that felt almost like relief after months of careful, exhausting strategy. To win the shares, she would have to publicly relitigate her own humiliation. To keep the last shred of dignity her father hadn't already stripped from her, she would have to let the shares go. She thought, unexpectedly, of the conversation with Jae-min weeks earlier, the question she'd planted so carefully, watching it root exactly as she had intended. She had expected the doubt to fester slowly, to widen into something that would eventually break the relationship apart on its own timeline, without her needing to lift another finger. She hadn't expected them to talk about it, hadn't accounted for a version of Jae-min willing to be honest about his fear, instead of letting it curdle into silence the way he'd once let an entire marriage curdle into resentment. Her assistant's report, delivered almost apologetically that same afternoon, confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect from the sudden confidence in the legal filing against her. "It seems closer, actually," the assistant said. "Whatever tension there was seems to have passed. Miss Chukwu was in every strategy meeting this week. They're presenting as a unified front." Something in Hana went very still, hearing this.
6 weeks of careful, patient manipulation, and rather than driving a permanent wedge between them, she had somehow given them the exact crisis they needed to prove to each other how solid the foundation actually was. She had failed, not through lack of skill, but through a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of what she was trying to destroy. That evening, she requested a final meeting with Jae-min, not disguised as business this time, no folder of shareholder documents to hide behind. He arrived at the small private room she'd chosen with visible wariness, the same caution he'd have shown walking into a meeting with a rival family. "I'm not here to ask you for anything else," Hana said before he could speak. "I wanted to tell you myself. I'm withdrawing the legal challenge. The shares revert to the company." Jae-min studied her carefully, waiting for the condition, the catch, the price she'd inevitably attach to something that sounded too simple to be genuine. Why? Because fighting for them would require exposing exactly how my father purchased my marriage publicly under oath, Hana said. And because I've spent the last 6 weeks trying to convince myself that making you doubt her was the same thing as winning something back. It wasn't. It was just cruelty with better manners than the last time. "Hana,
"Let me finish," she said, something raw entering her voice for the first time since the garden months earlier. "I asked you that question about Ada because I wanted you to feel the same uncertainty I felt for 5 years, wondering if I was ever anything more than an obligation to you. I told myself it was fair. It wasn't fair. It was just 5 years of pain looking for somewhere else to live." Jae-min said nothing, letting her continue, recognizing this as something closer to the truth than anything she'd offered him since the night the phone call first exposed her cruelty. "I watched my father sell me into a marriage I believed was real, and when it turned out not to be, I decided the only way to survive the humiliation was to make sure someone else suffered the same uncertainty I did. That was never about the company, Jae-min. It was never really about the shares. It was about proving I still had the power to hurt you, because feeling powerless was worse than feeling cruel." "Do you regret it?" Hana considered the question honestly, something she hadn't allowed herself the luxury of doing in months. "I regret threatening her life in that office. I've regretted that since the moment your mother's documents proved neither of us ever had a real choice in any of this. The rest," she paused, "the rest I'm still deciding how to feel about. I don't think manipulation stops being manipulation just because the person doing it is also in pain." It was, Jae-min realized, the most honest thing Hana had said to him in the entirety of their 5 years together. The consequences that followed weren't dictated by Jae-min or by Ada or even by the board that had watched the entire saga unfold with growing unease. They came in the end from Hana's own father, the man whose careful contingencies had started this entire chain of events years before his daughter was ever born into the debt she'd have to spend her life repaying. He learned of the withdrawn legal challenge and of the reasoning behind it within days. What followed was not comfort, not sympathy for a daughter who had finally chosen honesty over further humiliation, but a colder calculation entirely his own. "You've cost this family enough," he told her, in a conversation Hana relayed to no one but felt the weight of for months afterward. "The debt is exposed, the marriage is over, the shares are gone. There's nothing left here for you to protect, and clearly nothing here you're capable of protecting responsibly." He arranged within the month for Hana to oversee a smaller family holding in Vancouver, distant enough from Seoul's social circles to remove her from further scandal, distant enough from Jae-min and Ada to end any possibility of continued interference, framed publicly as a strategic business opportunity, and privately understood by everyone who mattered as exactly what it was. Her father cutting his losses, discarding the daughter who had become more liability than asset the moment her usefulness as a bargaining chip expired.
Hana left Seoul on a gray Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, without ceremony, without the send-off any daughter might reasonably expect from a family she'd spent her entire life trying to please. She stood at the airport gate alone, the same composure she'd worn through 5 years of a loveless marriage settling over her one final time as armor against a departure that felt less like opportunity and more like exile. She didn't call Jae-min before she left. She didn't reach out to Ada either. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in that small private room days earlier. And some part of her understood that dignity, at this point, meant leaving quietly rather than manufacturing one final confrontation neither of them owed her. Word of her departure reached Jae-min through a brief, formal notice from her father's office, confirming the transfer of the remaining shares and the end of any further claim on the company. He read it twice, feeling something complicated settle in his chest. Not triumph,
not quite relief, but the particular quiet sadness of watching someone destroy themselves slowly under the weight of a family that had never once valued her as anything beyond her usefulness. "She's gone," he told Ada that evening, sliding the notice across the table between them. Ada read it carefully. "How do you feel about that?" "Sad, mostly. Not because I want her back, because I spent 5 years married to a woman I never fully understood until it was already too late to help her, and now I don't think anyone ever will." "That's not your responsibility to carry," Ada said gently. "I know. I'm carrying it anyway for a little while." He reached for her hand across the table. "I think that's allowed, isn't it? To grieve something even when you know it needed to end?" "It's allowed," Ada agreed. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of them had fully believed possible months earlier. A peace that didn't feel fragile, didn't feel like the pause before the next disaster, but like something genuinely, finally earned. The company stabilized fully once the shares reverted. The Western Ports contract secured on terms that no longer depended on debt, obligation, or leverage held by people who'd never had anyone's best interest at heart. The board, having watched Ada navigate 2 separate crises with steady judgment and unwavering composure, extended her a formal partnership offer, not out of sympathy for what she'd endured, but out of genuine recognition of what she'd proven she was capable of building. Jae-min proposed in an ordinary evening in the small kitchen of the apartment that had become the first place either of them had ever called home by choice rather than obligation. No elaborate gesture, no audience, nothing borrowed from the calculated performances either of them had spent their lives navigating. "I don't want a marriage that starts as a transaction," he said, kneeling on the kitchen floor with a ring he'd chosen himself without consulting a single advisor or family expectation. "I want one that starts because 2 people actually chose each other and kept choosing each other, even when it would have been easier not to. Even when someone tried very hard to make it harder than it needed to be," Ada added, laughing through unexpected tears. "Even then," Jae-min agreed. "Especially then." She said yes before he finished the sentence, and when he kissed her this time, it carried none of the weight of everything they'd survived to reach this moment, only the lightness of 2 people finally standing on ground that belonged entirely to them, built by no one's design but their own. The lesson of it all, if there was one, wasn't that love simply triumphed over manipulation because it was fated to. It was that love survived because 2 people chose, again and again, to be honest with each other, instead of letting silence or doubt or someone else's cruelty write the story for them. Hana understood in the end that her real defeat was never the loss of the shares or even her father's cold dismissal. It was the discovery that the very thing she'd spent months trying to destroy had never been built on the fragile foundation she assumed, that some things, once chosen honestly, couldn't be talked out of existence by anyone standing outside them. Somewhere in Vancouver, in an office far smaller than the one she'd once commanded in Seoul, Hana began, slowly and without fanfare, to build a life that belonged entirely to her for the first time. No marriage to perform, no family debt to repay, no husband's attention to compete for. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined for herself. It was, perhaps, the first honest beginning she'd ever been given the chance to choose. What do you think the real lesson of this story is? That love survives manipulation through honesty, or that some wounds only heal once the people causing them are finally let go? Share your take below. And if you loved following Jae-min and Ada's story from beginning to end, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss whichever story comes next.